Hello! This week on A Nice Cup of History, we're discussing a very relevant topic in British political history, women's suffrage. Now that the dust from the recent general election on the 4th of July in the UK has settled, it seems like a good time to discuss this. We had hoped to do something a little closer to the election, however, we decided that it might be a good idea to wait a little bit, as even though we're happy to give opinions on historical issues, it's best for us to stay away from modern political views and stay neutral.
But, as women, we acknowledge the struggle of those before us when it comes to the privilege of being able to vote, and we wanted to talk about those struggles and why we take it seriously when those opportunities roll around.
And on this week's Ridiculous Death, we learn why dreams aren't always the safe space you might think they are.
So, grab your sash and your placard, make sure you've got your voter's ID, and
let's get historical. So, the initial facts. First things first, what is suffrage? The Encyclopedia Britannica defines suffrage as the right to vote in electing public officials and adopting or rejecting proposed legislation. The ability to vote had been a changing concept in Britain for a long time, and for a while was the only reserved for the upper classes and landowners, meaning that a comparative minority were able to have a say in how their country was managed.
Even as recently as 1884, legislation was being passed that allowed more men to vote. The Third Reform Act of 1884 built on the previous two Reform Acts, which allowed the vote to tenants rather than just landowners in borough elections. This latest legislation widened the net to both borough and county elections all across the UK. This new law meant that roughly 2 in every 3 men had the right to vote.
Note that we keep saying men. Specifically, women at this point were not allowed to vote. Here are a couple of the genuine reasons that women were prohibited from voting.
The mental exertion of deciding who to vote for would be too much for women, and in some cases would even cause infertility from the stress of it.
Women had inferior brains and a lesser mental capacity, and were therefore incapable of participating in politics or understanding what and why they were voting for.
If women were allowed to participate in politics, it would lead to them neglecting the home and their wifely duties, causing a negative impact on society.
It was also considered that women were too good and pure to be sullied by the impure nature of politics. That dirty taste in my mouth.
The problem is, women were still forced to obey the societal rules and legislations imposed on them through politics, but they weren't allowed to have a say in them, and that just didn't sit right. So they decided to do something about it. Trigger warning. The following will contain stories of violence and assault against women, borderline torture, and death. It's history. If it doesn't make you uncomfortable, you're not learning from it. But a trigger warning is still kind of valid here.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're going to talk about suffrage. On a technicality, women weren't exactly banned from voting at first. It just wasn't done. It wasn't until the Reform Act of 1832 and the
Municipal.
What does that mean?
I will Google it and find it out. I can use it in a sentence, but off the top of my head, I could not tell you the exact definition of it.
Amazing. And the municipal, I can't say the word. That's bloody good, isn't it?
Cool.
Use it in a sentence, Carrie.
Relates to like a municipal officer, so it relates to a town or a county, like governance. Your area, your municipal principality. So
until that Corporations Act of 1835, that something was put down in law to specifically say that women couldn't. This kicked off the movement initially. You can spend your entire life deciding not to do something because it's not really the done thing, but the second someone explicitly says you can't, that's the moment that you really want to. And that is just in everything in life. If someone says, do not touch that cake, and you're like, I'm having the cake now. But if no one had said anything, I'd be like, I don't fancy cake, I'm not going to eat it. But if everyone's like, you're not having it, I'm like, yes, I am.
You could walk into a room and there would just be a big red button there. And the button could be connected to absolutely nothing at all. It could do nothing at all. But the second someone says, don't touch that button, you are going to want to touch that button.
Yeah, you are absolutely poking that bear.
So the more someone says don't, the more you want to. In 1867, the National Society for Women's Suffrage was formed by Lydia Becker in Manchester. A further chapter was established in Edinburgh not long after, and by 1870 there were branches in a number of the major Scottish cities.
On the suggestion of politician Jacob Bright, a London branch was set up for the close proximity to the Houses of Parliament and therefore the London-based members of Parliament for lobbying processes. So, on the 17th of January 1872, the first meeting of the Central Committee of the National Society for Women's Suffrage commenced, with Lydia Becker as the chair, along with a name to remember, Millicent Fawcett.
Another society was soon set up to join the fight in 1897 with the founding of the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies, also known as the Suffragists, which is what we'll be calling them from now on, as the actual name and its acronym, NUWSS, are a bit of a mouthful.
Just a tad. So the suffragists were formed by merging of the Central Society of Women's Suffrage and the Central Committee of the National Society for Women's Suffrage. Mouthfuls.
Yep.
Lydia Becker had passed away in 1890, so this new group was under the leadership of Millicent Fawcett, and she remained in post as president for over 2 decades.
The purpose of the suffragists were to engage in peaceful and legal discourse to try and get parliamentary bills, which are the initial papers that would then become, hopefully, law if passed. It's a very oversimplification of the process, but and try to gain support for women's suffrage using non-militant means. The goal was peace and to demonstrate that women were capable of rational and logical argument and absolutely could be trusted with the ability to vote.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However, as with every attempt at change, there were those who thought that things were not moving quickly enough and that more drastic action was required. In 1903, a splinter group was formed called the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, also known as the Suffragettes. Now, this would get confusing, so an easy way to remember it is this. The suffragists want Parliament to get the gist of what they're saying. Suffragist. The suffragettes just want to get it done.
Yeah. Get the gist, get it done. Suffragist, suffragette, suffragette. Yeah. That's how I remembered it anyway, going to school. It's
a cool way to remember it, to be fair, considering the words are basically the same.
Yep. But genuinely, suffragists, non-violent. Suffragettes could be violent.
Mm-hmm.
The suffragists weren't against physical demonstration, though. And on the 9th of February 1907, a peaceful demonstration of over 3,000 women from across all social classes marched from Hyde Park Corner to the Strand in London. The heavy rain that occurred on that day earned it the name of the Mud March, because they basically got covered in mud from it. The date of the march was carefully planned to coincide with the opening of Parliament in the hopes that they could gain support for a new bill that had been proposed to the House of Commons.
Whilst there was a lot of public interest generated by the march, the bill did not even get voted on. Millicent Fawcett did not lose hope, however. She is reported to have said in a speech given in 1911 that the suffragist movement was like a glacier, slow-moving but unstoppable.
And with hindsight, yeah, she was right.
Absolutely.
Let's step away from the peaceful actions of the suffragists for a moment and have a look at what their counterparts were getting up to. Set up in October 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst, the term suffragette was actually originally meant as a slur coined by a newspaper reporter, I believe from the Daily Mail, but the group kind of took it and ran with it.
That's the best way to kind of deal with slander, just take it on.
Yeah, just be like, you know what, you're going to call me this? Fine.
That's what we are.
Yeah.
The motto of the group was deeds, not words, and they lived up to it. This is where the trigger warning now comes into effect, I'm afraid. We will put in the show notes where it is safe to listen in again after this bit if you don't particularly want to hear it.
The suffragettes, get my words out, started off mildly by heckling politicians and attempting to disrupt public meetings. They also attempted to boycott public censuses. As amateur genealogists, that's really not helpful, guys.
That wasn't that. No, not helpful.
I mean, we get why, but also no.
They then got more extreme and began to damage public and private property, smashing windows, setting post boxes on fire, and chaining themselves to the gates and iron fencings of the Houses of Parliament. These actions caused them to quickly fall out with the police, and many were arrested. It also did not do much to gain public sympathy to the cause.
Yeah, if you want, like, If you want the general populace to follow you and to support you, setting fire to things probably not the best way to go about it.
Very similar to another group that is going on at the moment.
Yeah, don't destroy public property. The public kind of are attached to it.
Yeah, do not throw paint on Stonehenge. Anyway, we digress.
The rage. Sorry. On 18th of... hang on. On 18th of November 1910, a particularly troublesome demonstration outside Parliament led to multiple arrests, during which the police were accused of unnecessary brutality, including both physical and sexual assault against the protesters. That day has become known as Black Friday for this reason.
Emmeline Pankhurst herself was arrested, and by this point she was no stranger to the inside of a jail cell. When in prison, the women had little autonomy and little opportunity to continue to fight for their cause, so they did the only thing they could do to regain a little bit of control in the situation. They went on hunger strike.
Whilst the police were a bit more, how can we say, handy with their fists and other parts than they should have been, some of these were middle-class women, or even higher, and it would just not do to have them die in jail. So the police took matters into their own hands in return.
Women on hunger strike would be taken to a chair where they would be held or tied down, their heads forced back to open the throat, and their mouths forced and held open. A tube would then be inserted into their mouth and pushed down the esophagus, and liquidized food would be passed through a funnel into the tube and force-fed down the woman's throat, where they would be forced to swallow or choke. The internal damage this would have caused, let alone the mental trauma, doesn't even bear thinking about.
In some extreme cases, they would also pass the tubes through the nose and down into the throat. So that would really mess you up.
Absolutely.
The women did keep fighting, however, and it was decided that something more visible was needed, as the message was not reaching high enough. This is where one of the most shocking moments in the fight for suffrage occurred, though it didn't have the desired effect.
On the 4th of June 1913, the 134th Epsom Derby was due to be run at the Epsom Downs racecourse in Epsom, Surrey. Just in case you didn't know, Epsom. It was and is a prestigious course, and on this day, an estimated 500,000 people were in attendance, including the then King George V and his wife, Queen Mary of Teck.
One of the King's horses, called Anma, was due to run that day. In the crowd at the Tattenham Corner, waiting, was suffragette Emily Davison, a member who, by that point, had already been arrested 9 times, 7 of which she went on hunger strike, so she was no stranger to extreme action for her cause.
Yeah, she was a tough cookie.
Yep.
It's in the name.
What, Emily?
Yep.
I would love to see how you survive on the inside of a jail.
Hey, I'm tough.
You are very tough.
Thank you. Witness testimonies now tell us what happened, though be aware that it would all have happened very quickly, and in the trauma of it, some details may have become confused or merged.
As a few of the horses passed Tattenham Corner, Davison ducked under the rails and ran forward, aiming for Anma. She reached up to grab his reins. Bear in mind, horses can go in excess of 35 miles per hour at a full pelt. She collided with the horse, and Anma was knocked over, stunned, rolling over a part of his jockey who was unable to escape the fall as his foot was caught in the stirrup. Davison was also knocked to the ground, where she fell unconscious.
Bystanders rushed onto the course, and the race was called to a halt as both Davison and the jockey were taken to the nearby Epsom Cottage Hospital. Davison remained in hospital and was operated on 2 days later for a fracture at the base of her skull. Whilst it is believed that Anma may have kicked her as they both went down, the surgeon who operated on her recorded no sign of a kick injury from a horse.
Emily Davison was pronounced dead from her injuries on the 8th of June 1913, aged 40, and her death was ruled as an accident, not suicide. Nobody's entirely sure what she was trying to do or hoping to achieve on that day. Like, some say, was she trying to pin like a
sash,
or a sash rosette to the horse, or was she trying to disrupt the race? Nobody really knows. The suffragettes hailed her as a martyr, but the press at the time were not so kind, and her sanity was regularly called into question.
Davison was honoured by a procession on the 14th of June 1913 to accompany her body from Epsom to London. Over 5,000 women formed the procession along with hundreds of sympathetic male supporters, walking from her coffin from Victoria to King's Cross with a stop off at St George's Church in Bloomsbury for Mass. It was described by one journalist as being like a military funeral in style. Once in London, the coffin was taken by train to be buried at the family plot in Morpeth, Northumberland, where further processions accompanied her at the arrival in Newcastle upon Tyne, almost like a guard of honour, and crowds met the train at almost every stop along the way. The funeral was watched by thousands of mourners, though the interment itself was a private affair. Deeds, not words, is etched onto her gravestone.
So, extreme actions.
That, I don't think you can get much more extreme than that, to be fair.
No. And whether it was her intention to actually sacrifice herself for the cause, or whether it was genuinely a tragic accident, it certainly drew attention.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily the attention that they wanted.
They do say no press is bad press.
This is true. I mean, it certainly got eyes turning in their direction.
It did.
But then something else came along.
Yes, something quite large.
Globally large, you could say.
Some may say it was great. It was not.
Yeah, great is a weird word for it. In 1914, something happened to put a pause on a lot of the suffrage activities, but also, oddly, absolutely helped the cause in an unlikely way. The First World War broke out. In August 1914, the government agreed to release all suffragettes currently imprisoned as a form of amnesty. Basically, it was an all hands on deck kind of situation. Recognising the severity of things, Emmeline Pankhurst ordered a stop to all militant activities by the suffragettes soon after. The focus now was on working together to help the war effort, because this, frankly, was bigger than all of them.
Whilst most men went abroad to fight, the majority of women were left at home in Britain, not counting nurses and other essential roles which called women abroad with the men.
Mm-hmm.
This meant that a lot of the jobs traditionally done by men would need to be filled or the country would grind to a halt. So women did what women do best. They stepped up.
In hindsight, ignoring the absolute tragedy inherent in the First World War, the opportunity given was one of the best things that could have happened to the suffrage movement, as it was a chance to show, rather than just say, what women were capable of. Political lobbies were still continued by the suffragists throughout the war, but the main focus was on keeping the country going so that the men that out there would have something to fight for and something to come home to, as well as generating supplies and weapons. Together, the women proved that they were capable of doing almost anything that a man could do, and in some cases doing it better. Women's football teams were even established as a way to have fun, starting in the ammunition factories, hence the nickname for Arsenal being the Gunners. And, women's football is still a thing today, and we're doing pretty well in women's football, actually.
Yes, considering we won the Euros and got to the final in the Women's World Cup.
Yeah, no, fair dues to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's about as much football as I talk about, but...
Considering we're recording this on the final of the Euros 2024, where England are in the final against Spain.
Yep, England's men's, that is.
Yeah. And
yeah. Football, yay, I know football.
You know the stuff with the ball that people kick with the feet.
Yeah.
When the war ended and men came back, there was a lot of expectation that everything would just go back to the way it was, but nothing could go back to normal after that, and a large percentage of the male population had been lost. This gave Parliament pause, and they sort of came to the right conclusion.
On the 6th of February 1918, a monumental piece of legislation was passed, the Representation of the People Act. This gave all men over the age of 21 the right to vote, but, more importantly, it gave women over 30 who met the minimum requirements around owning or renting property the right to vote. It was still heavily caveated, and it was slightly hollow, as women didn't really own property at that point, but it still allowed just over 8 million women in Great Britain to vote. It was a start.
I mean, you got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
From there, in November 1918, a second piece of legislation was passed called the Parliament Qualification of Women Act, which allowed women to be elected into Parliament. When the next general election was held in December 1918, women took advantage of their newfound privileges, and this resulted in the election of the first ever female MP representing Sinn Féin, if I said that right?
Sinn Féin.
I said it very wrong, in Northern Ireland.
Constance Markovich, I think her name was.
Because of her party's political views at the time, she declined her seat in the House of Commons. The distinction of the first woman to sit in the House of Commons went to Viscountess Nancy Astor in 1919, following a by-election win.
So pretty close on.
Yep.
Literally, as soon as women could be elected to Parliament, bang, there's one in there.
Yep.
It was brilliant. The fight wasn't over, however, as while some women had the right to vote, there was still a large number who didn't. In 1928, however, this all changed. The Representation of the People Act 1928 was passed into law, which extended the right to vote to all women over the age of 21, finally putting them on an equal footing with the men.
Whilst the fight for full gender equality definitely still goes on, the fight for suffrage was finally won in 1928. For Great Britain, at least. Whilst we don't agree with all of the methods employed, there is no doubt that the women involved did what they thought to be their best for their cause, some even giving their lives for it.
There is a lot more to the fight for women's suffrage than we have covered here today, and it wasn't just England, it was a global fight. But we wanted to keep it relatively brief, as we want to keep your attention, and also we have time against us with a book submission deadline looming. Eek.
Yep, 3 weeks. 2.5 weeks. It's all good. But we want to leave you with this. It is entirely your choice to vote. Nobody can tell you that you have to. Nobody can tell you that you shouldn't. The decision is absolutely yours. And that is thanks to those women. So when you're standing in that booth, ready to mark the paper, just give them a quick thank you.
So, that was it. That was women's suffrage.
I voted.
I voted too.
I always do.
Yeah.
I feel like as a woman, I kind of should.
Yeah, because of the hard work, the suffering, like the actual death that went into giving us the right to vote. It's kind of it's a privilege, but also you feel like you should.
Yeah, but it just makes my brain hurt, the fact that it's been within this century.
Yeah,
that
it hasn't even been 100 years since everybody got the right to vote over 21. Hasn't even it's 4 years away from being a century.
It's just I just don't like. Blows my mind that people thought that women weren't allowed.
Yeah, and the excuses for it, like it's laughable to us now, but at the same time, it's still the kind of belief that a lot of people. And I say people because women do also hold those beliefs as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of people still hold.
We know smart. We only cook, clean, mate. We know think. We know have vote.
We know power. We know good. We just home.
We home and baby make.
Yep. It's just
that is all do.
Yep. So it's all good for.
Hug.
We just devolved into cave for a minute. So, are we ready for one of our favourite segments? Ridiculous Death! So, you don't know this death, do you?
No, I really don't.
And we have.
I know you were talking about it, but I have no idea what it is.
We have someone to thank for this death who's going to get a mention in this. So, for this week's ridiculous death, we turn to 1924, keeping it in the era, not era.
Area.
Blah, 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 blah. Keeping it in the era. And the story of Thornton Jones, a lawyer from Bangor, in Wales. And we've had advice on this from our resident Welshman, John.
I will still say it wrong.
Yeah, he's in the other room at the moment, but I'm sure he would give us a hi if he could hear us. He just said hi in the background. I don't know if the mic will pick that up. One tragic day, Jones woke up to a burning pain in his neck. Turns out that the source of this pain was his throat having been cut in the night. Jones, in his final moments, motioned for a pencil and paper to be brought to him, and he wrote down, "I dreamt that I had done it. I awoke to find it true." 80 minutes later, Jones was dead, having cut his own throat whilst he slept as part of a dream. Official cause of death following the coroner's inquest was suicide whilst temporarily insane. So basically, he dreamed that he'd cut his own throat, but he actually cut his own throat whilst dreaming.
Oh, I don't like that. No, that's scary. What?
You've heard of sleepwalkers. You've heard of sleep talkers. Now this is.
I've heard of sleep
death.
headbutts, like,
Oh yeah,
but I've never heard of like sleep suicide. That's scary.
I'm laughing because our poor resident Welsh boy, whilst asleep, was fighting someone in his dream and headbutted someone, and turns out he'd actually headbutted Emily in real life.
That was a nice wake up.
I just got a message going, so I've just been headbutted.
That's scary. Imagine literally dreaming suicide and then actually waking up and you'd done it. Well, you wouldn't wait, what?
Also, how? How did he happen to have a razor by his bed or like a knife near his bed?
There you go. Another thing for us to go. Do not leave sharp objects on your bedside table.
Yeah, don't do it, because that kind of thing could happen.
Mate.
But it's that realisation, the first thing you wake up and you're like, oh crap, I have actually done this.
Honestly, absolutely not.
Yeah. It's
no, thank you.
Yeah. Well,
that's the Suffragettes.
That's the Suffragettes, and that's a kind of
What an ending.
Yeah. And thank you there, Thornton Jones.
For
yeah.
I don't even know what to say, if I'm honest.
I mean, would a woman have done that?
A woman wouldn't have been stupid enough to go to bed with a razor by the side of her bed.
We'd like to think not.
Don't be wrong, women be stupid.
Yep.
But we don't always be that stupid.
Yeah, that's a new level.
That's a whole new level. Well, we shall be back probably after our book has been submitted.
Yep, in a couple of weeks' time.
Oh my God, I feel sick.
And then we're going to try after that, because at the moment it's all still a bit up in the air with timing, so we're going to try and be a bit more regular after that, because we do have the rest of the story of Henry VIII to tell.
My bae.
Plus Dark Cup episodes.
Oh yeah, we need to bring Dark Cup back. Yeah. I'm excited for Dark Cup October. We didn't do it last year, but we do one a week.
Yes.
I'm excited for Spooky October.
I think we're going to have to go harder this time. We're going to have to make it spookier.
How? We've got some planning. If you've got any spooky stories or anyone you think we should talk about, please get in touch on Cup of Fist of Tea, anywhere on socials, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or cupoffistoftea@outlook.com.
You can also, through our Buzzsprout website where we host our podcast, send us messages through there, so we can pick those up as well. But for now, thank you so much for listening.
Take care. Oh, and come on, England.
Yay, football.